Alright, hi everyone. This is the review video for Exam 4. Once again, I want to let you guys know I'm recording this video right after I recorded the lecture video for this week, so there is the potential for grass cutting noises to be going on in the background, just to let you know. So remember that Exam 4 is the required proctored exam, so it is absolutely necessary for you guys to take this exam with an appropriate proctor. Not just because the exam is going to be password protected, but also because it is an online class, and so there is a requirement for you guys to pass the class that you have to have this exam taken with a proctor to verify your identity, okay? So Exam 4 is going to be released on Monday, May 2nd, and will be available until Friday, May 6th. So it'll be released at 8 a.m. on Monday. It'll be available until 5 p.m. on Friday. If you have some kind of emergency that prevents you from taking it with a proctor, you need to let me know ASAP so that we can figure out a solution. Maybe we can Skype while you take it or something like that. We have to have an appropriate proctor here. Okay, so let me know if you have any issues. This is very important. So Exam 4 is going to be just like Exams 1 through 3 as far as the format. So it'll be multiple choice, true, false, matching. There'll be the 2 opinion questions like there always are. And I'm going to wait until everyone takes the test to go in and make sure that everyone got full credit for the opinion questions. That's just really the only way to do that in Canvas. Some days I miss Blackboard. But anyway, getting into the study guide for Exam 4, so it's going to cover love and attraction, prejudice, and aggression. So with love and attraction, we talked about, first of all, what it is that makes us like someone. So we said that the propinquity effect is caused by the mere exposure effect. And this is the idea that the more that we see someone, the more that we like them, which means that we're more likely to be attracted to someone that we spend a lot of time around. We are also more likely to have a successful relationship with someone who shares a lot of similarities with us. Doesn't necessarily mean that you and your partner have to be like identical copies of each other, but it does mean that when it comes to those important issues, like perhaps religious beliefs or whether or not you want to have kids and how many kids you want to have and how you want them raised and that kind of thing, how you're going to handle the money, it's very important for you to have these things figured out ahead of time and come to some kind of agreement about it. Because couples who have a lot of similarity in those important issues are more likely to be successful, less likely to have conflict. We do see that we tend to like similar partners when we're thinking about long-term relationships. Whereas if it's going to be a short-term relationship, we tend to choose very different partners, maybe because it's exciting and it's different, and because if it doesn't work out, that's okay. We never intended for it to work out. Reciprocal liking means that we like people who like us. And so if someone, even if they're different from you, even if they're not the kind of person you would usually be attracted to, if they like you, it makes us like them a little bit more, right? We know that physical attraction is very important when it comes to initially liking someone. We typically see that men will report that physical attractiveness is more important to them than females will report. However, when we look at their behavior, there doesn't seem to be a lot of behavior differences. So maybe women are just not aware of how important physical attractiveness is to them, or maybe there's some kind of social desirability bias where women don't want to say how important physical attractiveness is to them. Facial features that are considered attractive were a little bit different between men and women, but basically things, you know, big smile, large eyes, I think was one, a small chin for women, a strong, larger chin for men, that kind of thing. We did see that there was a kind of cultural universal where symmetrical faces were considered attractive. The what is beautiful is a good stereotype. We're going to talk about stereotypes in a minute. But stereotypes are really just the idea that you have a belief about someone because of their group membership. So just because someone is attractive, you have certain beliefs about them, which typically are positive beliefs. So people rated these attractive people as being more sociable and more sexual and more intelligent and more successful and all these other things, which is obviously not always the case. We talked about different styles of love, and particularly we talked about companionate versus passionate love. So companionate love is going to be high on intimacy, high on commitment. You feel very close to that person, but you don't necessarily feel attracted to them physically. Now this could be a romantic relationship, or also could be like a friendship or family member, that kind of thing. Now, passionate love is one where it's predominantly that physical desire, right? Attachment styles, we talked about how they develop and how they impact relationships. We said that individuals who have secure attachment styles probably had healthy relationships with their parents and are more likely to go on and have successful, trusting relationships with others. We said that individuals who have that anxious, ambivalent style might have had inconsistent parenting, so sometimes they received affection, sometimes they did not, which makes them be very anxious and clingy in their own relationships. And then we talked about the avoidant attachment style, where individuals might have not had really any kind of affection and therefore are more likely to kind of avoid commitment, try to avoid those serious relationships. But we also said that attachment styles are not definitive, that they can change, they can be influenced, right? Social exchange theory was just the idea that we have like a pros and cons list, and that the outcome of whether or not we stay in a relationship or how happy we are in a relationship has a lot to do with whether we feel like we are getting the best bang for our buck, right? Whether we feel like we are getting as many pros as possible and very few cons. Equity theory is the idea that we are happiest when our relationships are equitable. In other words, when they're fair. So an equitable relationship is one where both partners are putting in equal time and effort. So when you have one partner who's doing everything, that partner is under-benefited. When you have one partner who's doing nothing, that partner is over-benefited. And so this is probably going to cause problems if this goes on for very long, which leads us into our discussion of the divorce rate. So we talked about how the divorce rate in this country is 50%, and maybe that's because there's less of a taboo against it. Some of those barriers are not there anymore, that it's easier to get a divorce. It's not looked down on as negatively, and there are lots of reasons why the divorce rate has gone up. One thing that we talked about was that fatal attraction, where something that you liked about the person a lot when you were first with them ends up becoming a problem the longer you're with them, and maybe actually the thing that you dislike when you end up breaking up, right? So that was love and attraction, very briefly. And then with prejudice, we talked about how prejudice is an attitude, which means that we have the ABCs here, right? The affective side is the emotional side. I like this person or I dislike this person. I don't feel comfortable around this person, perhaps. The behavioral side is the discrimination, where you actually do something that treats one person unfairly. And then the cognitive side, the stereotypes, this has to do with what you believe about someone else. So we talked about how typically when we hear the word prejudice, we think about negative things, but it could also be positive. The basic idea of prejudice is just that you have either an emotion or a behavior or a thought process that is specific to this person because of their group membership, because of their race or their appearance or their religious beliefs or their occupation or any number of things, right? So when we're talking about someone having a prejudice, it just means that they have some predetermined ideas or beliefs based on someone's group membership. We talked about the example of gender stereotypes, about how people have different beliefs about someone based on the gender that they have, and then it talked about hostile versus benevolent sexism. This is the idea that in hostile sexism, women are viewed as being very inferior, that they don't have the same rights and the same opportunities. Benevolent sexism also views women being different based on that group membership, but sees them in a more positive light. Sometimes we see this on television shows where the wife is portrayed as being the intelligent one who fixes everything and the husband is a buffoon, right? Sometimes you see this. So both of those are sexism because they are treating men and women differently based on their gender, but it can either be something that treats women as inferior or as superior, right? How to measure prejudice. We talked about how it's difficult because people may not be aware of their prejudices or they may be afraid to be honest about them. So we talked about having to use some sneakier ways of researching this. We talked about the bogus pipeline where people think they're taking an lie detector test when they're not. We also talked about an implicit attitudes test where individuals are answering the questions so quickly that theoretically they don't have time to kind of change their answers. So an implicit versus explicit prejudice just has to do with whether or not you're aware of your prejudice. An implicit prejudice is one that we might not necessarily know that we hold, whereas an explicit prejudice is one that we know that we have, that if you asked me a question, I would tell you about it. Now, an implicit prejudice can still impact our behavior, and so maybe the best way to measure prejudice is just to see how someone behaves. Stereotype threat is a way that individuals are negatively impacted by prejudice. We gave the example here of women having this belief that they are not as qualified to take a math test as men, and that when we give them a test and we say, you're going to be compared to men, they didn't do as well. The idea behind stereotype threat is that individuals feel anxious about confirming someone else's negative beliefs about them, but that anxiety can then cause a decrease in performance, which then has this like negative self-fulfilling prophecy. So when we talked about where prejudice comes from and how to decrease it, we talked about how it's mostly driven by an in-group bias, where we like ourselves, and so we like the people who are in our group because they're probably very similar to us. And so then we like the people in our group mainly because of the self-esteem, right? Because we want to feel like our group is special. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's good to like the people in your group. The problem is when you start treating people who are not in your group in a bad way because they're not in your group, right? Out-group homogeneity is the belief that they are all alike. In other words, people who are not in your group, that you don't need to get to know them because they all have the same negative characteristics, right? Which obviously this is not accurate. Very rarely would you find an entire group of people who share all the same characteristics. It's very unlikely. It's much more likely that if you got to know them, you would see that this was not true. But the ultimate attribution error has to do with the way that we assign causation, so that we tend to make those kind of dispositional internal attributions for what people do. So if we see someone behaving in a certain way, we say, yes, they're doing that because of who they are. The problem with that is that that may not be accurate. There may be something about the situation that's causing them to behave that way. You can make a lot of mistakes here. That's why it's called an error. And this can also lead to blaming the victim, where we think that whatever bad thing happened to someone happened because of their internal dispositional nature, something about them that caused it, which we do that to try to protect ourselves and our in-group members. Now I feel like because I'm not in that group, it won't happen to me and it won't happen to my friends and my family. The problem here, though, is that obviously it can lead to us not having empathy, and because it can be inaccurate, right? Because bad things can happen to anyone. Then we talked about how this was going to cause cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling when our beliefs and our behaviors don't match up. I believe that I'm a good person, and yet I'm behaving in a discriminatory way. So, usually, the way that individuals try to reduce this is by coming up with a justification for it, right? They seek a valid justification for it. That way, they can keep their belief, whatever the stereotype is, and they can keep their behavior, and they don't have to feel bad about themselves because they feel like they're being accurate. I'm not being prejudiced, I'm just telling it like it is, right? So they seek a valid justification, usually. Now, this is probably not, definitely not the best way to handle it, but it is usually how people do it. So ways to reduce prejudice. The main idea here was that we need to bring the groups together, put them on equal footing, and give them a common goal. And then that theoretically would give them a reason to form one big group, because a group is just based on individuals who are together, who need each other, right? And then the last lecture was about aggression. So we talked about how men tend to be more physically aggressive, women tend to be more relationally aggressive. We talked about how there's a correlation between testosterone and physical aggression, although we don't necessarily know that testosterone is causing the aggression, but we know there's a correlation. We talked about cultures of honor, that individuals who are male and southern and in rural areas are a little bit more likely to be aggressive when they feel like their honor is being damaged in some way, some kind of insult. We talked about influences on aggression, so we said that people are more aggressive when they've been drinking. or when they think that what they've been drinking is going to impact them a lot. We talked about how pain or discomfort, being hungry, having a headache, being tired can cause you to be aggressive. We talked about frustration and about how individuals who feel like someone is preventing them from reaching their goal are more likely to be aggressive. We talked about social learning theory being the nurture side of things, that you see other people being aggressive and so you're more likely to be aggressive, which led us to discussing the Bandura Bobo doll study, where children who saw an adult being aggressive with the Bobo doll were much more likely to go in and imitate those exact same aggressive behaviors, whereas children in the control group who did not see an aggressive adult were not aggressive with the Bobo doll. Which then led us to the discussion of media violence, and we said there's a correlation between watching violent media and being aggressive. And we don't know for sure, once again, if this is causation, but we do know that when you watch media violence, it does give you ideas, gives you examples, it teaches you that aggression is okay, it causes an increase in your heart rate and your blood pressure and that kind of thing. So then we should be cautious when allowing children to view violent media. Okay? But once again, think about the kinds of television shows that kids watch. I mean, some of the cartoons are the most violent shows when you think about it, right? Like the Wile E. Coyote and anyway. Very good. Back when cartoons were really cartoons. Very good. All right, so this is the study guide for Exam 4. It is posted for you guys. Remember that you need to take Exam 4 as the proctored exam. If you feel comfortable with all the topics in the study guide, then you're probably going to do great on the exam. Remember, this is the proctored exam, so you will not be able to take your notes. So make sure that you're prepared. And just let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, you guys have a great day.